Yes, you may proceed, Mr. Mkwena.
Thank you. Mr. Mohamedi, just before the lunch adjournment, you were still taking us through the payment of interest and penalties. Just give us a high-level summary on that topic, and please also, reference it with page 275, so that at least we are able to appreciate the essence of your testimony around the interest issue.
Thank you, Advocate. Chair, I think the first point that needs to be made is that there was a total of 297 million rand that was paid to China South Rail as a result of a delayed payment. This is made up of two components. The first part is a 229 million rand interest, and the second part is what is called a foreign exchange adjustment. Relating to the first part, as I said, it is of interest that the group treasurer at the time sent an email to China South Rail giving them the computation of the interest. And secondly, he also provided them with the computation of the foreign exchange adjustment. It is not common practice for us to provide a service provider or a supplier with a calculation of these amounts. Chair, what is also quite interesting is the fact that the contract with China South Rail was a rand-based contract, and all of the forex was mitigated and hedged in the rand-based contract. So one is, from a finance point of view, we are confused, if I can use that term, as to why we would pay a foreign exchange adjustment to a rand-based contract, which had no reference to forex in that contract.
Is the significance of the term rand-based contract that the creditor takes the risks of the rand fluctuation without being able to say, but look, we should take into account, for example, the US dollar rate? Is that what the significance is of that term?
Chair, you are correct. The creditor assumed all of the risk.
Yes.
And that was factored into the pricing.
Yes.
As it was entered into between Transnet and the OEMs at the time.
And if the parties are negotiating a contract and the party that will be paid some amounts doesn't want the agreement to be rand-based, then they put forward the proposal that, for example, the amounts must be US dollar based. Is that right? And if they don't put that, that means they accept that the transaction will be rand based.
That is correct, Chair. If the risk is, my apologies, if the risk is assumed by Transnet, then it would be Transnet's responsibility to take all of the forex hedging.
Yes.
In this case, it was agreed between the two parties that all of the risk and the hedging would be for the supplier's account, and it was factored into the pricing.
Yes, and of course I assume that if it's rand-based, depending on what happens, in the markets, you could be lucky that it could go up or go down. The rand could go up or go down, and so that's, if it goes your way, then you might benefit. If it doesn't, then it's just a risk that you accepted.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay.
Yes. And that's why it's odd on this particular penalty that we actually paid an amount of 59.8 million as referenced in MSM 278 to China South Rail for what was marked as the cost of rolling forward an FEC because of the delay in the payment. But what is also significant, Chair, is that this is a financial services transaction. In addition to the fact that we believe it was RAND-based and we should not have been levied this penalty, in addition to that, we were also levied VAT on this transaction, which is not in terms of the VAT Act. So we paid a total of 68 million rand that relates to what is called the foreign exchange forward rolling of the FEC.
And anyone within Transnet dealing with this contract would have known or at least checked the terms of the contract first before putting Transnet at such financial risk as agreeing to these types of costs. One would have thought that they would go through first and see whether it's a RAND-based contract or not.
Yes, Chair. I think in addition, it would have also required that it be more than just a finance transaction, that you would have had the legal teams look at it, the operational teams look at it before we agree to a significant payment of this nature of 297 million.
Especially when you are talking about very big amounts.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Now, against that background and clarity, Mr. Mohamedin, turn to page 276 so that we can move on and explain to the chair what is this document and its purpose and what is the amount in the light of what we've now clarified with the chair.
Chair, document number 276 is essentially the invoice that we received. As you would note, it's dated the 2nd of June 2015. As I presented, Mr. Ramasubudi submitted this calculation to China South Rail on the 1st of June. So literally one day later, they take the amount that was on the spreadsheet of 229,367,461 and include it to an invoice and submit it to Transnet for payment. And this was effectively paid.
And if you turn to page 278.
I'm sorry, before you do that, the General Treasurer, I think you said his position was, or was it she who gave China South Rail these calculations? Would he or she have been involved in the authorization of the payment later on when the invoice came, or would he or she not have been involved in that?
Chair, the group-
Mr.
Or is there
Ramasubudi.
something coming up?
No, Mr. Ramasubudi was the group treasurer at the time, and he provided the information, but he didn't make the physical payment. No, he didn't authorize the physical payment, Chair.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Now, I was referring you to the second document in order to tie up your evidence. The document is at page 278 and identify that for the chair and also comment on its contents.
Chair, page 278 references an invoice, again, from China South Rail to Transnet for the amount of 59.8 million, with the description being the cost of rolling the forward exchange contract, and then VAT being levied on that for an amount of 8.3 million, showing an invoice total of 68.2 million rand, which was subsequently paid to China South Rail. Once again, Chair, the amount of 59,855 million is the exact amount that is reflected in the spreadsheet that was sent to China South Rail by Mr. Ramasubudi at the time.
Yes. Now we can then move on, Mr. Mohamedi, and deal with the advance payment from page 5, paragraph 5.3.10 of your statement on page 12, Mr. Chair.
Chair, subsequent to the conclusion of what we call the locomotive supply agreement, which was for the 1,064 locomotives to the various OEMs, Transnet then, using the 1064 contract, and alluded to the procurement process being followed through that contract, commenced with a process with China South Rail for a maintenance agreement. And this maintenance agreement was not limited to the 359 locos that were to be built in the 1064, but rather it was to include other locomotives that China South Rail were building or had built. That was including the 95 and the 100. Once again, Chair, a recommendation by the Board of Directors, a submission was made directly to the Board of Directors, at which point the Board of Directors recommended that Transnet engage the Minister of Public Enterprises for approval of this particular transaction. At that time, this transaction was valued approximately 6.1 billion rand. The submission was made to the Board of Directors in July 2016 and subsequently recommended. The application was made to the Minister and approved by the then Minister of Public Enterprises, Ms. Lynn Brown. What is also interesting in the submission is that China South Rail requested what they called or termed startup costs, totaling 10% of the value of the contract, which means it equates to 618 million rand plus VAT. In October 2016, this particular payment was effected and China South Rail was paid a total that was in the region of approximately 700 million, which included VAT. Chair, in October 2017, again, I think the timelines are quite important. The approval or the recommendation from the board is around July 2016. There's approval from the minister, and there's a payment that's effected in October 2016. A year later, in October 2017, there is a document where the group chief executive informs China South Rail that as a result of the number of allegations of corruption, this award will essentially be suspended. This is in October 2017. That document, I believe, is in the pack under MSM 16, I think it is. But we'll look at that.
MSM 16, Chair,
Okay, thank you.
which will be now on the second bundle, I think.
Oh. Now that is on BP3.
2B.
Uh,
2B.
Chair, my apologies. I think the letter I refer to, my
Yeah.
apologies, Advocate, is MSM 15.
15.
15, page 340. What is MSM 340?
Okay, that's the last
Document.
document on that Live Arch 5.
Yes, Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, in this letter to the chairman of CRRC, which was the holding entity for China South Rail, it says materials and reliability support contract, page 340. Transnet, amongst other things, we refer to previous correspondence on the signing of the MRS contract. Transnet is a state-owned entity and has to conduct its business, incur expenses, and procure materials and services in compliance with, but not limited to, the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa and the Public Finance Management Act. We had reached finality on the negotiation of the MRS contract and were ready to sign. However, due to the corruption allegations that surfaced through the media on the 1064 procurement, we had to negotiate the newly proposed representations and warranties clauses. Further to the above, Transnet SOC has commissioned a forensic investigation on the allegation of corruption relating to the procurement of the 1064 locomotives to ascertain the parties' involvement or non-involvement in the alleged corruption process. The forensic investigation commissioned has not yet been finalized. The last line there says, ultimately, Transnet SOC would prefer to resign the complete MRS contract with the proposed representations, warranties, clauses as opposed to signing the addendum. Transnet will only be in a position to issue a letter of effectiveness to CRRC subsequent to the complete MRS contract being signed by both parties. As far as we are aware, that process was never concluded. The issue is that, Chair, that letter was issued in October 2017, actually the 26th of October 2017.
Yes.
But no effort was made in recovering our 700 million that was lodged with China South Rail from October 2016. That process only commenced in July 2018, Chair.
So the process was suspended and nothing happened for a number of months, for about 8 months, 9 months, right?
Yes, Chair.
Yeah, okay.
And our funds remained with China South Rail in that period. Chair,
And what are the purpose of that money before you proceed? Why was it? Why were they paid such an advance? I mean, such a huge sum of advance payment.
what is essentially stated in the contract, I think we've, or in the submission from China South Rail, is what they've termed startup costs, to actually commence with producing some of these strategic spares locally in South Africa, creating the capacity here. As far as we are aware, July 2018, when we commenced the process to recall these funds, they had not yet commenced with any of those processes of startup. They contend differently, but that's our contention as Transnet.
Yes, then proceed.
But in terms of the letter that we just dealt with now, they would not have been expected to do anything until the issue of allegations of corruption had reached finality.
Chair, yes, Chair, there were two provisos. One was exactly as you point out, and the second was the signing of the MRS
Yes,
agreement,
yes.
which, as far as we are aware, had not
Yes.
taken place.
Yes, okay.
And what happened with the funds ultimately?
In July 2018, there was a process that commenced through Transnet Engineering to recover these monies from China South Rail. We did have what is called an advance payment guarantee in place, a guarantee that was provided to us by China South Rail at the time, an unconditional guarantee that was provided by the Bank of China to Transnet for the amount of 618 million. It was the amount excluding the VAT for some reason. And we then proceeded to inform the Bank of China as well as China South Rail that we were going to recall the guarantee essentially. All of the processes related to that commenced in about September, the latter part of September 2018, and we reached finality in the first week of December 2018 when China South Rail repaid us the 618 million rand. To date, China South Rail have not yet paid us the VAT portion, which is the 86 million rand equivalent for that transaction. That remains outstanding. We have had numerous interventions with China South Rail requesting these funds to be paid to us. Unfortunately, to date, it still remains outstanding.
What reason do they advance for not paying it?
Chair, at this point, we don't get a response or we don't get a reason for non-payment. We had a commitment, the chairman of the board of directors, as well as myself, met with an executive from China South Rail at the beginning of this year. We had received some indication that they would be remitting these funds, but unfortunately to date we have yet to receive the funds.
Is that one of the matters in respect of which there is either pending litigation or there is litigation contemplated? Or you are not sure about that?
No, we're not sure, but I don't think on the 86 we've issued any litigation, but what we have done is we've written to them and provided and requested payment, so that will follow due process within our business, Chair.
Well, it may be one of the matters in respect of which the chairperson of the Transnet board indicated that there was a preference to try and reach an amicable settlement because litigation can sometimes take too long, and in the meantime, you might not end up getting what you want. So, yes, okay.
Mr. Mohamedi, maybe to complete on this issue and for completeness, may I refer you to Exhibit BB3B, that's now the second file, and go to MSM 1818. May you please identify that document and take us through that document?
Chair, this is a letter that is written by Transnet
I'm
to
sorry, that is what divider?
351.
18.
18. Okay, thank you.
18.
Chair,
Yes.
on page 351 is a letter from Transnet to the general manager at CRRC, demand for payment of an amount of VAT and interest relating to the maintenance and reliability support agreement between Transnet and CRRC E-Loco Pty Limited. Essentially, we raise the issue in paragraph 2, where we say, in terms of the provisions of the letter of award, an advance payment in the amount of 704.7 million was made in favor of CRRC, and such amount was made up of 618 million and VAT at 14% in the amount of 86 million. CRRC was required to utilize the money as startup costs and also to procure rotables. As a result of non-performance on the part of CRRC, Transnet Engineering, TE, proceeded to claim a refund of the total amount paid to CRRC. However, CRRC refunded only the amount of 618.160 million and held back the VAT amount of 86.542 million. TE, Transnet Engineering, is entitled to be refunded the VAT amount and interests amounting to 136.4 million. TE therefore demands a payment in total of 223 million to be paid into the following bank account. We will appreciate if the above payment, the banking details are provided, and we will appreciate if the above payment is made into the above account by no later than 7 days upon receipt of this letter, failing which TE will be left with no option.
This is the letter that now ties in with your evidence that you adduced before the chair pertaining to the VAT component that was still outstanding and not yet being paid.
Yes, Chair.
Yes. Now, can you turn to your statement with particular reference to page 13, Exhibit BB3A. The first file, Chair.
Yes, and what page on that one? Are we back to the statement?
13. 13. 13.
Yeah.
From, are you there, Mr. Mohamedi?
Yes.
Yes, and please take us through your new topic highlighted as the unlawful appointment of regiments and subsequent increase in its scope and budget. Take us through the relevant facts under the topic.
Okay. Chair, in May 2012, Transnet issued an RFP to the market for service providers to provide transaction advisory services as it related to the procurement of the 1064 locomotives. At the tender closing date, there were a few consortiums that actually bid or provided bids and proposals in response to that RFP. We list them. There's one that we call the KPMG Consortium, which comprised KPMG in Konki, Norton Rose, Akasgib. The PwC Consortium, which comprised PwC, CIR, DB Engineers, Cliff Decker, Hofmeyr Incorporated, and the McKinsey Consortium, which comprised at the time McKinsey, Litsema, Uto Capital, Koikanyan, Nedbank, Edward Naden Sonnenberg, and ART. ART represented by Mr. David Potter. And Weber Wenzel, attorneys, submitted a proposal only for procurement and legal services. Chair, there's a point that on the 6th of December 2012, McKinsey was awarded with a letter of intent for this particular service. However, it's important to note that that was through a confinement process. This process of the RFP was essentially non-awarded at the conclusion of this process.
So the open tender process was commenced, but was abandoned, and then a confinement process was then pursued.
Chair, that is to the best of my knowledge at the
Yes.
moment.
Okay.
There was a letter issued on the 6th of December 2012, or signed on the 6th of December. The letter is dated the 30th of November 2012 and signed on the 6th of December 2012, where Mr. Anod Singh, representing Transnet, informed the McKinsey Consortium the letter of intent for the provision. I'm referencing item MSM 19, page
354.
354 in Exhibit BB3B.
B, yeah.
Yes.
Chair, this letter goes on to explain the letter of intent and some of the key deliverables in that contract. It also lists, in this contract, it lists regiments, McKinsey, and some of the other service providers that will be providing service in terms of the requirement for the 1064 locomotive advisory. At the time, this particular letter of intent under Annexure A on page 360 refers to an amount in terms of the deliverables must be executed for a fee of 35.2 million rand as the fee note below. Any overrun in terms of the time will not be for the account of Transnet, as the engagement is output-based and not time-based. McKinsey will take overall responsibility for the deliverables and the quality of the end products. Expenses will be capped at 10% of the value of the engagement for the supplier and its subcontractors. It's important to note that at that time it was outputs-based. It had some very specific outputs that were included, financial, project management, procurement, legal. We can go back to this, but it had all of the key deliverables that were required from this particular transaction. Chair, the constitution of the McKinsey Consortium at the time had now changed, as we pointed out earlier on. And
Well, before you talk about that, Mr. Mkwena, will you investigate whether we can't get a better copy?
Better copy, Chair, yes.
Not
Mr.
only of this one, there are a number of copies which are quite poor and difficult to read.
We'll do that, Chair.
Yeah, and maybe that could be passed on to all members of the legal team for the future, that perhaps where there is a copy that
It's not legible.
is not legible or is quite poor, if they can make attempts to try and get a cleaner copy.
We'll
Okay,
do that,
all right.
Chair.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Mahomedi.
Chair, this letter of intent also excluded, just by the way, Chair, it excluded the legal services. On page 335, it specifically stated that the supplier agrees to relinquish all legal services to Weber Wenzel, and goes on to state that further more clearly. The key objectives that are outlined in this particular document.
So I'm sorry, just about that. That sounds quite strange, doesn't it? For Transnet to say, when they've got a transaction that obviously needs a lot of legal advice and guidance, to say they relinquish all legal services from within Transnet. Now, normally, Transnet will instruct outside attorneys, will instruct lawyers from outside if they want to instruct lawyers. I'm sure they do so every day without having a clause such as this. Or is it a usual kind of thing to include something along those lines?
Chair, in this case, I think the original consortium, if I remember, included a firm of attorneys from McKinsey as well. So essentially, I think it included Edward Nathan Sonnenberg.
It wasn't Transnet saying they would relinquish Transnet legal service or legal services from within Transnet.
No, Chair. What it says was the supplier, being McKinsey, the consortium, will not conduct any legal services. They relinquish all of the legal services to Weber Wenzel.
Or in other words, they would not instruct other attorneys.
Yes. Yes, Chair. That's largely what it means. Also, what it says is that notwithstanding the appointment of Weber Wenzels by Transnet, the supplier will oversee all work and deliverables supplied by Weber Wenzel and manage the deliverables of the entire advisory service. So I assume there was some integration, but it was an exclusion, because initially it was included and then it became an exclusion.
Okay, all right.
Chair, I think I just want to touch on the key deliverables included in the original letter of intent. A robust and de-risked business case that is fully supported and approved by the board and the shareholder. That was one of, it's on page 336 towards the bottom. Developing and augmenting the business case for the approval of the locomotives by the Transnet Board of Directors and Department of Public Enterprises. Procurement, I'm not going through all of them, but procurement and legal talks to all of the different aspects of the advisory, technical and operations. Financial, it was talking to developing financing and funding options, and then to develop deal structures, financing, hedging and de-risking options. Project management office, provide the stakeholder engagement, etc. The reason that we're doing that is because it will become relevant when we talk about the role that then was perceived by regiments, for example.
Were you reading from page 356?
356. Yes,
Yes.
356 of the pack.
Any other issue that you want to highlight there for the chair?
As I said on Chair, on page 360, again, I think it may not be entirely legible, as you pointed out, Chair, but what it does talk to on page 360, I have a slightly clearer copy with me. As I said, Chair, it says deliverables must be executed for a fee of 35.2 million rand, as per the fee note below. Any overrun in terms of time will not be for the account of Transnet, as the engagement is output-based and not time-based. McKinsey will take overall responsibility for the deliverables and quality of the products, expenses at 10%. It then goes in and explains that the consortium for the various aspects total was 35.2 million rand.
And then if you go to page 358, who signs?
The signature from Transnet side is Mr. Anuj Singh
Yes.
on the 4th of December.
Now take us through the contents of paragraph 5.4.4, Chair, on page 14 of your statement.
I see that in the page in which McKinsey's people sign, or person signs, the director there are witnesses who witness his signature, but
No
on
witness.
page 358, where Mr. Anuj Singh signs on behalf of
There's no
Transnet, nobody signs as a witness.
That's true, Chair. The documents that we've got and we've seen do not include a witness to the signature.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mohamedi, paragraph 5.4.4 and onwards.
Chair, the constitution of the McKinsey Consortium, now effectively from what was originally submitted, is now including regiments. And it comes in under the perspective of a supplier development partner. And I think they were not part of the initial procurement process anyway. This is possibly a breach of the Transnet procurement manual and Transnet supply chain policy, as it's a change, fundamental change in the consortium that was originally bidding for the work. I think further down, Chair, on page 14 of my testimony, we provide under 5.4.6, we provide a perspective on all of the different dates in which Transnet either concluded extensions or contracts with McKinsey.
That is quite crucial, Mr. Mohamedi. Could you please take us through that, foreshadowing the evidence of other witnesses to come?
Chair, the first document that commences this process is a document that's issued, what we call the letter of intent, as we've just gone through, dated the 6th of December, and that's the date that it's signed by the McKinsey principal. There is a first addendum to this document, which is essentially to ask for an extension in the validity period of the LOI. The LOI had a specific validity period. I think it was 3 months, if I remember correctly, but there's a specific validity period, and it needed to be amended, as it says in the LOI, may be amended or modified in writing by the authorized signatories. There was an amendment that took the document out. There was a second amendment to the LOI in October 2013, which extends the validity period further to the 30th of November 2013. There's an agreement for the provision of the transaction advisory services to Transnet in January 2014. That's the document, Chair, I referenced earlier on, saying that there was this side deal, if you would like to call it, that was long before any session, because McKinsey was still the heads of agreement with the transaction. So on the 20th of January, there's this transaction or a agreement between Transnet and regiments. There's the purported session that also took place on the 5th. Sorry, my apologies. There's a third addendum to the LOI, and this is to transfer the scope to regiments. On the 5th of February, we provided that letter for the agreement or the session in which McKinsey informs Transnet of their intention to move all rights and obligations through to regiments. The master services agreement for this particular transaction is signed on the 21st of February 2014. Chair, there are subsequently 2 further amendments. So up to the 21st of February or the 5th of February, that is the extent to which McKinsey were involved. Now on the 28th of February 2014, we noticed that the fees of 35.2 million are now increased to 78.4 million. And this is largely with regiments as the service provider or the lead consortium partner.
And this is done by way of
A memorandum.
a memorandum, nothing else.
No, it's a memorandum. Chair, then on the 16th of July 2015, there is a further memorandum. Again, Chair, it's a memorandum that is submitted to the, I think I recall it was submitted to the Acquisitions and Disposals Committee to move the total fees on the Loco 1064 advisory to close to 289 million in total. Chair, that is, there are other amendments as well, but I think largely what we're saying is that it moved from 35.2 million to a total somewhere in the region of 289.5 million rand in total.
I'm trying to, so where do you find 289?
Chair, actually, I'm going ahead of myself, but on 5.4.82, we explained that it moved to, 81, sorry, on page 16 of my statement.
Oh, okay.
It says that it moved, this amount increased to 289.5 million in total.
So what we did, Mr. Mohamedi, you took into account this entire contract, you looked at the different variations through the addendums, and you made certain observations. And those observations are from paragraph 5.4.8. And if you can take the chair through the observations of the review that you have now done in the light of all these contracts.
Yeah, because I asked you about that figure because I was looking at the figure
Yes.
of 166
166.
million. Yes.
Chair
Yeah.
will explain that hopefully.
Now explain to the
Yeah,
chair and
go
give the
ahead,
context to the amounts.
Chair, the amounts that finally were paid to the different consortium partners included a number of things that went into what was then called Loco Advisory Services. There was an amount of 166 million that was paid to regiments under the auspices of Loco Advisory. However, it was actually for executing a funding transaction. Chair, I think at this point it's also important to note that regiments, as I read out part of the scope, it was to determine and formulate funding plans and funding strategy. It would not be to execute those strategies, because there would be a conflict. And in the Loco Advisory, included in this 289 million, is an amount of 166 million, which was paid to regiments, which was then called the success fee for the China Development Bank loan. This also becomes relevant as we go further into the document, Chair, when we talk about the transactions, funding transactions that Transnet was involved in for 1064. So included in the 289 is a 166 million that was paid to regiments for this particular execution of this funding. Of the total 289 million, Chair, regiments was paid 267.7 million rand, which equates to 92% of that fee, which largely means that they had become the lead in the consortium. Also quite relevant when we look at the conflict of interest that arise later on in our review. The variation, again, we talk about the process, Chair. And I think Advocate McQuena asks about the initial process, the procurement, but the variation in this process would have required, in my view, a new procurement event, particularly when we look at the 166 million that was now included, because that was for a fundamentally different event, and we should have executed an event for that. However, I say that with caution, because I give due credit to our Transnet Treasury team who had the capability to execute this transaction with China Development Bank without the assistance of regiments. So, if I may phrase correctly, if there was a need for it, then it would have been a separate procurement event. It should not have been included as one bundled event that then cost us a total of 289 million. I hope I'm making myself
Yes.
clear, Chair.
So, but your evidence is that Transnet had enough people who could do this, and there was no reason why an outside firm was required to be involved.
Yes, Chair.
Yes, okay, thank you. And once again, in regard to this, as was the case with another issue that you dealt with, you have not been able to find any document in which contains an explanation or justification for not using Transnet's own expertise and capacity.
Chair, we're not able to find a document that suggests that we didn't have the capacity.
Yes.
We,
Or that gives whatever explanation you have not been able to find any such document.
no, Chair. In fact, we will present evidence to the contrary.
Yes, okay.
What did you understand by this success fee of 166 million? What did the regiments do to be entitled to such an amount?
Well, the explanation is complex in terms of the memorandum that have been included. However, simply put, what it says is that regiments were the arranger of this particular transaction with the party being China Development Bank. This is paid out in 2015. I think it's July 2015. What is also quite interesting is that Transnet had already approached China Development Bank way back in 2014. So when Regiments was paid this, in fact, the then treasurer of Transnet, group treasurer, raised an alarm bell then to say that there isn't a need for Regiments to be involved in this at all, because the Transnet team had the capability and they had executed transactions that were of similar size, if not bigger, with funding institutions locally.
Yes.
So I think the key problem there was that, the Regiments is purported to have done the transaction, but it had commenced a while ago. And some of these transactions, to give you a perspective in the treasury space, a transaction of this size would take a while. It's not something that you conclude on very quickly, because these are significant numbers, even in global terms. This particular transaction with China Development Bank was originally being considered at $2.5 billion.
It is difficult to listen to your evidence as well as the evidence of the other two Transnet witnesses who have come before me, and hear all these large amounts that were being paid out in, to say the least, very questionable circumstances, and not ask yourself the question, but how does it come about that such large amounts get paid out and somebody doesn't pick up the problem before they actually paid out, except that the answer must be that if the authorization was made by people not as senior as the people who authorized, then one would look at the senior people and say, where were you when such large amounts were, when lower level people in the company were authorizing these types of payments, but when it's people right at the top, there is a problem about who is the one who would pick up and stop these things, because some of them were approved by the board itself. And then you were either talking of either GCEO or a CE of an operational division or a group chief financial officer. So it was top people. So maybe that's basically the explanation.
Chair, I think you capture it very succinctly and correctly. In this particular case, if we look at the payment of 166 million, the authorization was from the Group Treasurer of Transnet, which is a very senior position, Mr. Ramusubudi, the Group Supply Chain Officer, meaning the Head of Procurement, Mr. Gary Peter, the Group Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Anod Singh, and the Acting Group Chief Executive at the time, Mr. Gama. So when we're talking about the four, it's about the most senior four people in an organization with the structures of Transnet. Even if a lower level employee were to question the authority for payment, they would be given this document and say, well, in fact, this particular document was then presented to the Board Acquisition and Disposal Committee and authorized by that board subcommittee. And I think you correctly put it, Chair, that it's the most senior executives in the business that are instructing. That signature appears on the memorandum. It's approved. There'll be an excerpt of the minute because the person who's making payment will ask what authority this payment is made. And he or she will receive all of these supporting documents that give rise to this payment. And accordingly, the individual, whoever at whatever level, will make the payment based on the signatures that are on the document as well as the approval of the minutes.
And some of these transactions, it may be argued that it's not as if Transnet didn't have procedures which would have allowed these transactions to be flagged, to be picked up by somebody as not appropriate if they had gone through those procedures. The procedures were there in regard to, but they were simply bypassed, or it was confinement or confidential confinement. But even if it wasn't that, they were dealt with at a very high level, and anybody below that had no chance to make any contribution and had no chance to pick up the problem and try and stop it.
Chair, just to illustrate the point you're making, Chair, this particular document, once again signed by the four individuals, was submitted directly to the Acquisitions and Disposals Committee, a subcommittee of the board. As far as our reviews have brought out, that this once again is not a document that served at any management committee. Because in the management committee you would have too many people to then convince differently. That is my view.
But what this does demonstrate is probably Transnet now has additional mechanisms, but what it does demonstrate is that the Commission may have to look at what mechanisms should be put in place for a situation where it's the very senior high people who seek to authorize illegitimate payments. What should be done to make sure that they can be picked up? Maybe it's difficult to provide because normally for people at that level you expect that they would look after the interests of the organization, but it may be that one should look at what really should be done because can't afford a repeat. Obviously, one of the important things is to only appoint people of a certain level of integrity at those high positions. But it may be that something must be looked at to say, if something like this were to happen again, would Transnet be subjected to the same kinds of losses?
Chair, I don't know if I want to respond to that, but I think it's safe to say that the current board has reviewed the delegation of authority.
Yes.
In terms of that, just last week, I bumped into the chairman in the corridors of Transnet, and he said to me that we should never allow you, referencing me, to become a one-man party in this organization. And we should not give you any authority that can create this problem again. And I think it's a fair comment in the sense that the delegation of authority allowed for people individually to sign certain transactions. That largely has been withdrawn in the current delegation of authority that exists in Transnet on the board's instruction. And we have now what we call individuals are authorized to sign only if cross-functional committees review the document and approve certain things. So, yes, I agree with your sentiments entirely.
Well, it's said that when any country draws a constitution, they should have in mind the worst possible scenario in terms of president or government. Make provision for that and not have in mind a very good government and a good president. So maybe what this means is that with SOEs too, simply saying we will try and appoint people of integrity at these high positions might not be enough. It might be necessary to say, let's assume we have done everything we can to make sure the person is one of the right level of integrity. What happens if, despite that, something happens? Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair, you'll recall that Mr. Volmink did attempt to give some of the recommendation. He took us through different structures of the
Yes.
current board and
Yes.
also identified
Yes.
those concerns and anomalies in order to address, you know, what was actually occurring
Yes.
during that time in Transnet.
Yes.
Maybe that will go a long way,
Yeah.
coupled obviously with other things that might be said to strengthen this SOE's procurement structures. But there is also a far much more fundamental concern, Mr. Mahomedi, having taken the chair through the amounts that were used or the amount that were paid, you know, to regiments. If I may take you back to page 13, with reference to paragraph 5.4, and I think that's where you commenced with your evidence. But it only makes sense now when we now see these huge amounts being paid to regiments. Only now that we see the importance of your evidence. In this paragraph, you identify the parties and you take us through the different consortiums, am I correct?
Yes.
And if you go through those consortiums, you say that on the tender closing date, then you give us the names of the different consortiums. You will not, I mean, can you come across the name of regiments in any of those consortiums?
No, they were not included in any consortium.
But yet, when you take the chair to page 16, paragraph 5.4.81, they appear to have been paid an amount in excess of an amount of 1.66 million.
166 million.
Yes.
Yes, and regiments were replaced through a variety of other conflicts that were noted at the time. As I mentioned earlier, there was a supposed conflict with Letsema in the advisory team as well as Nedbank.
There was a point which I thought you were about to make at some stage, and I don't know if you made it, with regard to what regiments was paid. When you look at the amount that they were paid, you referred to the fact that, in effect, I think what they did or what they were supposed to do related to funding, and I think funding only and not other things. So I wonder whether part of the point you wanted to make was that, in effect, the amount that they were paid was for much more than that, and whatever much more wasn't work they had done. Is that part of the point you were making, or you sought to make? In other words, even if you were to say, as far as the funding aspect is concerned, they were entitled to charge and be paid, certainly there is a lot of money that they were paid for, which would fall outside the funding work that they may have done. And for that part of the money, they did not do anything.
Chair, that is correct. The question that goes back to the LOCO advisory letter of intent, it says developing finance and funding options, developing deal structures. It doesn't talk about execution. It talks about developing them.
Yes.
Yet, in the same contract which regiments took over from McKinsey, if I can use those words, regiments is then paid 166 million rand for facilitating a loan transaction with China Development Bank by Transnet. The 166 million is what Transnet pays regiments. The question is, so what work did they do for 166 million in value for that payment to be made, when particularly a year before that, almost a year before that, Transnet had already commenced conversations with China Development Bank, and we will provide that evidence a little later on.
Thank you.
Yes. We can now move on, Mr. Mohamedi, to deal with your topic on paragraph 5.5, page 16, exorbitant transaction advisory fees on the CDB and the club loan. But before you do that, can you please educate us as to what are these club loans?
Chair, I think before we talk about the club loan, it would be necessary to give some context as to the,
Yes.
the source and the creation and the reason why some of these loans actually came into being. Obviously, we had the 1064 program now, if you want to call it in play. The contracts were signed. We needed to fund these transactions. So Transnet and the Treasury team at the time would have to sit down and think about how we would fund this 49 billion rand, these contracts.
And the Treasury team you're talking about, is it the Treasury team from National Treasury or from within Transnet?
Ordinarily, it would be the Transnet Treasury team within our office, within our structures. However, in a number of instances, they have not been party to being involved at all. It remains key throughout the document, sorry, throughout my testimony from here on. So in around August 2014, as I said, the previous group treasurer, Ms. Matane Makato, actually visited and had conversations with China Development Bank to provide us with funding to the value of approximately, at the time, the discussions were $2.5 billion. At that time, the forex rate was about 12 rand. That would then give you funding of 30 billion rand. The discussions between China Development Bank and Transnet progress to the point where they would give you what is called indicative pricing, etc. At some point in 2015, steps in regiments. Ms. Makato writes an email before that, also in the documents where we'll get to that, where she registers her discomfort with the involvement of regiments. Chair, as we'll progress through each event, but what then happens is China Development Bank and regiments agree that the amount will be $1.5 billion. That's what they are prepared now to put on the table as a guaranteed funding option, and that's what regiments presents. So the other $1 billion, with the rate still at around 12 Rand, there's a strategy to now get what is called the domestic market involved and see what we can come up with, and that is then termed the ZAR Club loan. The ZAR Club loan is simply a South African Rand loan that is put together with more than one financial institution. In this particular case, the 12 billion Rand was taken up by the Bank of China locally, 3 billion Rand, and again this is in Rand. This is in South African Rand, so that's why it's called the ZAR Club loan. ABSA takes 3 billion.
Can
Nedbank.
Can I take you slightly back so that the chair can follow? Are you now taking us through the contents of paragraph 5.5.2?
Yes, Chair.
Yes, Chair, then please take us, it's on page 16, Chair.
I've got it, thank you.
So I'm at the second part of it. We'll talk about the first part, China Development Bank. We've spoken about 1.5 billion. The ZAR Club loan, again, Chair, is 3 billion Rand for ABSA, 3 billion Rand from the Bank of China, 3 billion Rand from Nedbank, 1.5 billion Rand from Future Growth, and 1.5 billion from OMSFIN, which is an all mutual entity. That's the creation of the ZAR Club loan. What is also important is that that was not the sum total of all of the funding for the 1064. So we touched on the China Development Bank of $1.5 billion. That was based on a drawdown facility, which means they gave you the facility, and as you needed, you would draw that down and then pay the interest. Then in addition to that, sorry, Chair, my apologies for going a bit. The China Development Bank loan was specifically, when the 1.5 billion was agreed, it was specifically for the CSR and CNR locomotives. The ZAR Club loan, the 3 billion that the Bank of China gave from the 12 was also specifically for the Chinese locomotives. The balance of 9 billion was secured under what we call general funding principles. In addition to that, we also were able to get into a transaction with the United States Exim facility of 5.7 billion Rand. That was done for the General Electric locomotives because GE is largely an American company, so the American Exim was prepared to fund this transaction. And then there were two more funding transactions on page 17, Chair, which is called the Export Development of Canada, the EDC, together with Investec locally, and KfW Development Bank, which is out of Germany, for amounts of 6.992 billion and 2.76 billion respectively that related to the Bombardier locomotives. This is essentially all of the different loans that we undertook during the time of the 1064 locomotives.
Now these transactions, I mean, you have referred to the Treasury Department within Transnet. Were they not capable of sourcing or securing these loans from these various institutions without having to involve any other external entity?
The Transnet Treasury team had the capacity and capability to execute these transactions, as far as we are concerned.
Yes. Now, you also draw the attention of the Chair to some of the prejudicial conduct from paragraph 5.5.3 to the detriment of Transnet. Can you please take us through them?
Chair, as I touched on earlier on, in terms of paragraph 5.5.4, the China Development Bank loan had already commenced discussions, or our team had already commenced discussions for the China Development Bank loan with China Development Bank. And then we had the advent of regiments into the transaction. And as I explained earlier on, Chair, 166 million was paid to regiments for this particular piece of work, which could very easily have been executed by the Transnet Treasury team. Under 5.5.6, when it came to the ZAR Club loan, we have subsequently, or since the transaction, we have identified an invoice that was paid to Trillion Asset Managers for an amount of 82 million rand, excluding VAT, Chair. And there are subsequent memoranda that talk to the provision of a lead arranger service from Trillion Asset Management. Once again, this document is signed by a few key individuals and approved by the very same ADC at the time. This was in around November 2015. So once again, Chair, the syndication of a loan is not a complex structure for our Transnet Treasury team. These are things that we would do on a regular basis. And we would call relevant banks together, we would sit with them, explain to them what the requirement is, present to them and say what funding we require, and then institutions would normally come back to us and say, we are prepared to invest in Transnet at these values, these are our terms and conditions. That will be assessed, and then a final decision would be made.
But
Here again,
do you know why Trillion was paid that amount? What did they do to be paid that
well,
amount?
it's alleged that they were a supply development partner to regiments. That's the information that has been presented. But in the discussions that we've had, we are unable to find any documentation or any evidence that Trillion did in fact do any work on the ZAR Club loan. We don't believe, and we're not able to, we had discussed this with the previous treasurer. We asked for simple documentation around meetings that were held, that were scheduled, that would have shown Trillion members of management or executives or members of their staff that attended these conversations or meetings. Because, Chair, this is in around November, December 2015, between November and early December 2015. And the payment is made at that time, but we are not able to actually find any evidence that any work was actually performed by Trillion.
Yes, you may proceed with the contents on paragraph 5.5.8. Unless there are any other specific amounts which you wish to highlight for the chair in relation to those amounts stated above.
I think, Chair, if we need to go to 5.511.
Yes.
And the email or my suggestion earlier on that
I'm sorry, that is
5.5.11 on page 19, Chair.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Chair, under a document that is, the document is under MSM 22, page number 450, MSM 450. I would like to, if it is allowed, that we read some of the contents of this particular email.
Yes,
Firstly,
you may do
identify
so.
Firstly, identify the email and tell us.
The email is from Matano Machato, sent on the 21st of August 2014 at 12:54 p.m.
Who is she, before you proceed?
She was at the time the group treasurer of Transnet.
And she's addressing this letter to who?
She's addressing this to the chief executive, Mr. Brian Molefe, as well as the group chief financial officer, Mr. Anod Singh.
And do you know what was the purpose of this letter?
The purpose was talking around the matter of regiments and China Development Bank.
Yes. You can take the chair through the relevant portions of the letter which you wish to highlight.
Chair, in the first paragraph, she states, "This email is a follow-up of various discussions I had with yourselves and in some instances with regiments included, where I had indicated my discomfort and disagreement on how the China Development Bank facility negotiations are being handled, regiment's pricing methodology, as well as my disagreement of the appointment of regiments as the transaction advisor for the facility." Under the overall governance, midway through that particular section, Chair, she says, "I do not support that a 26 billion rand facility be negotiated and led by a transaction advisor, as we cannot and should not negotiate a loan facility in isolation of Transnet's current 90 billion rand debt portfolio." She goes on to say, "When we negotiate a facility of this magnitude, we assemble a multidisciplinary team that includes legal, tax, accounting, structured finance, and risk management team members. This is to ensure that all possible risks relating to the facility are identified and mitigated to the extent possible."
Just before you proceed, I think it's important to highlight that last sentence of her first paragraph, where she says, "For the avoidance of doubt, I would like to bring the following to your attention." So it looks like this is somebody who wants to make sure that her position is clear and that nobody among those or between those to whom she is addressing the email can later on say, "I did not know." Okay?
Chair, you
Proceed.
correctly point that out.
Yeah.
In addition, Chair, I omitted to mention a statement that she made. She says, under one, overall governance, in the second sentence, she says, "As I indicated, I was not consulted, nor was I aware that Regiments was appointed as the transaction advisor and lead negotiator for the facility, as I believe there was no need for them to be appointed given progress that we had made," clearly indicating that Transnet Treasury had already engaged with China Development Bank and they had made progress.
Also making the point that you yourself have made, that on some of the instances we are dealing with situations where, at least as far as Transnet is concerned, there was no need for certain external services to be brought in. Okay,
Yes, Chair.
you can proceed.
Chair, under point number 2, fees and interest expense, she states the current pricing indication is not in line with other DFIs. A DFI is a developmental funding institution, asset-backed or even tied facilities. I'm skipping a sentence and reading, "As China Development Bank facility is tied to procurement from China, as it is supposed to support CNR and CSR locomotive contracts, the terms and conditions should mirror that of tied facilities as well as asset-backed facilities. These two elements, tied and security, should translate into cost-effective funds which should be close to local funds as well as simpler terms and conditions." Chair, the reason that is quite critical is because the funding with China Development Bank is what is called a securitized loan. And meaning that the locomotives that are procured from CNR and CSR are taken as a bond,
As a surety or?
As a surety.
Surety, yeah.
as a surety over that loan.
Yeah.
And that's the point.
So that if the loan is not repaid, they can actually take those locomotives. Is that right? Attach them or something to that effect?
That is correct, Chair. It
Yeah.
is, you know, a simple,
Yeah.
like a lease, HP hire
Yes.
purchase agreement where
Yes.
the vehicle is always
Yeah,
owned by the
repossessed,
lender
yeah.
until
Yeah.
it's fully paid off.
Mm.
And that's the current situation with the CDB loan.
Which was an adverse condition as far as Transnet was concerned, is that right?
That's correct, Chair. And
And-
what the point that is being made here, if with that, you should have lower,
Yes.
overall, the risk is
Yes.
lower because they've
Yes.
now got a
Yes.
collateral.
Yeah.
Chair, further on the next page, she goes on page 451 to provide a very detailed look at the China Development Bank proposal. And the amounts and the rates that are quoted here relate to the $2.5 billion. So I'm just providing clarity that it was changed subsequently. At that time, it was relating to the $2.5 billion proposal that was on the table. In her view, she says that a fair price would be JIBAR plus 210 basis points, and that's the Johannesburg interbank rate. And I've taken into consideration the size of the facility. In the current market, the proposed CDB structure will cost 3.5 billion rand more in interest expenses, and that is based on the $2.5 billion debt. Based on these numbers, we have looked at it on the $1.5 billion, it equates to just about 2 billion rand in additional or higher interest bills. That's what it would, that was her calculation in August 2014. Chair, under conclusion, it talks as follows. It is my belief that the CDB facility in its current form is not in the best interest of the company or the country, given potential capital leakage of up to 3.7 billion in excessive interest expense and excessive arrangement fees, which may be classified as a PFMA violation, given information at our disposal. The additional interest expense will have a negative impact on the already fragile cash interest cover ratio. I therefore recommend that we terminate discussions with China Development Bank and explore other sources of funds. Transnet has proved its ability to raise funds from diverse funding sources, even under trying circumstances. In 2008 and 9, we were able to raise over 22 billion rand, even when the market was closed for other issuers. The latest example is our ability to raise 8 billion rand for the locomotive deposit at short notice. And she goes on to explain her position.
Now, she gives this detailed letter or memo to the two senior officials identified by herself in that letter. Do you know whether did they follow her advice?
The advice was not followed because we continued with the China Development Bank loan. We continued to use regiments as the advisors. We paid regiments the 166 million, so clearly that was not necessarily, that advice was not taken. In addition,
Do you
sorry.
know whether they responded to, that is Mr. Brian Molefe and Mr. Anuj Singh, whether they responded to her memo or email?
Chair, I'm not aware of that.
Yes,
I'm not
okay.
aware of a response.
Okay.
If they responded, I mean, in your review of these documents, you would have actually come across
Yes.
such a document and clearly, refer the chair to such a document.
Yes,
But throughout your review, you never found any response.
we haven't found any response to this. Chair, there are certain pertinent facts that we must also disclose around the China Development Bank loan.
Yes.
Transnet had paid what is common practice in the banking environment. We pay an upfront fee for certain facilities. Not necessarily always the case, but in some cases we pay an upfront fee. To China Development Bank, we paid an upfront fee which equated to 17.7 million US dollars. At the time of the transaction, we believe the rate was closer to about, again, 12 rand, which will mean that we paid 212 million rand. The reason I state this, Chair, is because it was out of kilter with what was paid to other institutions at the same time. If it pleases the Commission, under MSM 20, page 367, we try to provide a summary to certain transactions focused on the funding of the 1064 locomotives.
Before we talk about MSM 20, Mr. Mokoena, I think MSM 22, the one we have just dealt with,
Yes.
is very important. It would be very helpful for steps to be taken, if they haven't been taken, to provide, to get proof that the email was received by the two persons to whom it was addressed.
We have gone far
Yes.
much more further than that, Chair.
Yes, yes.
We will be calling Ms. Matana Makatu
Yes,
to
okay.
testify on the specific issues
Okay,
and other related issues.
okay. No, that's fine. Thank you. Yes, we are back at MSM 20.
Chair, under the page number MSM 367,
Yes,
Chair, we endeavor to provide the Commission with an overall perspective of some of the key transactions and funding arrangements that were put in place in and around 2015. This becomes relevant further when we talk about the interest rate swaps. And Chair, if we look at the upfront fees in column C, Chair, in
Yes.
column C of page 367, we provide the upfront fees that were paid to the various institutions.
yes,
One will note that the upfront fees equated to between 0.3 and 0.45%. The upper limit being 0.45%. However, as it relates to the China Development Bank facility, which is at the bottom of the page, we will note that we paid $17.7 million, which is based on what we've drawn up to today, equates to 1.18%, which is approximately twice, even more than twice, what was paid on all of the other facilities that we had taken. And again, for purposes of
I'm
transparency,
trying to look for the figure that you,
Chair, if
Dave.
we look at the bottom of that page, it says China Development Bank,
yes,
US dollar, then there's an amount of 1044. That's the total amount we've drawn up to now.
That's the figure I was looking at, but I thought you
Okay.
said 17.
Yes, then next to that on the right, Chair, is two columns down is $17.7 million.
Okay. Yeah, I think
As a
the-
percentage of what we've drawn, it equates to 1.18%,
Okay,
as compared to the 0.3 that we paid and 0.45%. It's just about more than double, close to 3
Yes.
times
Yes.
what we would have paid locally.
yes.
There's also, all of these facts give corroboration to Ms. Makhato's mail, where she says there was an ability for us to actually borrow this money cheaper on the local market. There's one very fundamental issue, Chair, that we have to put on the table at this point. By securing the funding in US dollar, I go back to testimony that we gave earlier on around the hedging costs of the 1064 increase in ETC. I would like to try to simplify this, but simply put, Chair, we spent billions, literally, to hedge the 1064 locomotive contract because all of the OEMs there were international service providers or OEMs, and they would have quoted you, their underlying currency would have been a foreign currency. And we spent all that money to hedge it into rand. The problem is then we go and borrow in dollars to hedge it again into rand. So from a benefit to the country perspective and the benefit to Transnet, or shall I say the erosion of value to Transnet, is not on one front. It's running into multiple billions because we spent that money, and if it may please the Commission for a very simple explanation is, I buy a car and they tell me it's $100,000. But today's rate is 14 rand, whatever, and the bank says, well, if you want to pay it in 2 years, we'll charge you 16 rand. So that car will work out to 1.6 million rand for me. But then I go back and I say, no, I can't get funding locally. I will go and borrow $100,000 from a foreign bank and then convert that loan into rands again and pay for that conversion again. And because this is a long-term loan, because it is for 15 years, the cost of this, what is now in the Treasury term called a cross-currency swap, is what we pay for again.
Yes.
So we've hedged the 1064 locomotive program, it's cost us billions, and then we hedge, we borrow in billions, and then we hedge again. So it's a double whammy as far as the total cost base of Transnet is concerned. And it's quite an important
Yes.
point, Chair.
Yes. So in a way, it's difficult to find sense. Is that the point you make, that it is difficult to find, it's not sensible?
I actually support the submission of Ms. Makhato. She says we
Yes.
should not be progressing with
Yeah.
this transaction with China Development Bank. We had to have explored all of the opportunities
Yeah.
locally
Yes.
with our domestic financial institutions to decide.
Yes.
And by the way, Chair, also financial institutions from overseas are prepared to lend us in rand as well. Transnet is largely an entity that conducts its business within the borders of this country. Its revenue and cost base is largely in South African rand. So it does not necessarily make good financial sense to borrow in dollars, particularly when you potentially have lenders who are willing to lend you in South African rand.
Thank you.
But if these transactions were so prejudicial to Transnet, why would they still be proceeded with, having to take into account what you say are serious losses that could be incurred by Transnet? And I'm asking this question against the background of also a thorough advice that's now being proffered by one of the experienced internal members of Transnet dealing with the same issues, why would anyone proceed with such a transaction?
The only possible and plausible explanation from my perspective would be that there was an agenda for a payment to be made to regiments, ultimately, or some entity that existed outside of the system. Why would Transnet, in good conscience, engage in a loan agreement that has got a significantly or a possibly prejudicial interest rate in the first place, that comes at a higher cost? Also on page 367, Chair, across the line, you will note under column F,
Yes.
an amount of 330 million that was paid to China Development Bank for what is called a commitment fee. That is when you do not use the full facility that you ask for. So every time you draw down, you pay a commitment fee on the difference. So when you consider all of these factors, this would have been more expensive, particularly if you consider the cost, and I'm using the term loosely, the cost of hedging the loan, because the banking institutions may get offended. It's actually called a cross-currency swap. But the cost of all of these things, when you add them in, they have brought additional cost to Transnet's financial position, and it's affected us adversely.
Yes. While you're still on that, also, if you can comment on the column H on the very same page as to who would be the beneficiary and what does it represent?
We put that for purposes of clarity and confirmation. As I said, on the ZAR Club loan, 82 million rand plus VAT was paid to Trillion. At this point in time, we have not seen any evidence of work performed by Trillion on the ZAR Club loan. And then on the China Development Bank loan, the 166 million that I referred to earlier on was paid to regiments. So just based on the funding, you see just about R250 million
Yes.
being paid out when expertise existed in Transnet to execute these transactions, which, by the way, we currently are executing transactions, maybe not the size of this transaction, but we do execute with local and foreign institutions these type of transactions with the people that are currently employed in the Treasury team, who largely are there for a number of years.
You worked with both Mr. Anuj Singh and Mr. Brian Molefe for quite some time at Transnet, or not really?
I worked with Mr. Anuj Singh for quite some time, Chair.
Yes, and Mr. Brian Molefe as well?
Mr. Molefe, for a period of about probably he was the chief executive for a while, but I worked with him
Yes.
for a period of about 2 years.
Yes. When you look at that email or memo that was written to them by, is it Ms. Makgatlo?
Yes.
You are satisfied that all the points she makes in that memo to them are points that they would both have easily understood
Chair,
in
Mr.
terms of their
Singh.
knowledge and experience and their qualifications?
Yes, Mr. Singh on a number of occasions acted as the group treasurer of Transnet in the absence of treasurers at the point. So when I say that, meaning at points when the position of group treasurer was vacated and there was an absence of an appointed person, he would act as the group treasurer. And Mr. Molefe, I think we all are aware of his experience at the Public Investment Corporation at the PIC. And that is an institution that is very heavily driven by treasury-related transactions and investments. So what the points that are made here would be easily understood by people with their
Yes.
extreme expertise and experience.
Yes. So some of these things that, some of the points that Ms. Makgatlo makes and some of them you have made yourself, to the extent that they make it, they make what Mr. Anoj Singh and Mr. Brian Molefe may have been doing not to make sense. Maybe they would be the ones who could explain why they didn't follow, go along with these points made by Ms. Makgatlo.
Chair, I think in reading this today and in preparation for the Commission, one looks at the very clear perspective that Ms. Makgatlo provides. And also, Chair, I would like to add, in discussion with the officials that were in Transnet Treasury at the time, who have been, some of whom have been at Transnet for decades, literally, they were perplexed by the choice of loans, by some of the transactions that Transnet persevered with, if I can call it that. And in some cases, they were also deep in the dark when these transactions were being negotiated. As you know, Ms. Makgatlo says, the involvement of regiments as a lead arranger or advisor did not make sense to her. But it also, Chair, if I may provide an opinion from myself, it does not make sense from a pure business point of view in terms of the conflict of regiments. They were, in terms of the LOI, tasked with defining the funding principles and the funding mechanisms and methodologies, and then become the executors of that funding transaction. And later on we'll see that it didn't just stop there. They then became the executors of the swap transactions, which again talked to a very deep-rooted conflict that was not declared. Neither was it acted on when the people who signed off these payments were very well aware that regiments were conflicted in all of these things that they presented to Transnet. They were the formulators of the funding plan. They were the executors of the funding plan. They became the executors of the interest rate swaps and collected significant amount of money. And then they were also, by the way, you'll see later on, Chair, where the counterparty of some of these swaps were the Transnet Pension Fund. And they became, and they were the pension fund asset managers, and then became the recipients of the pension fund, paying them literally a couple of $100 million. So we have to look at it holistically to get that perspective and understanding that regiments' involvement, and I think Advocate McKenna started out with that conversation, they're dropping into the local advisory as a supplier development partner suddenly when there were other conflicts, has to question. One has to question the intention of that particular decision by the powers that be at the time.
Yes. I mean,
Thank you.
following up from these pertinent questions raised by the chair, and I think this is important in the light of the testimony of the chair of Transnet, Mr. Popo Molefe, and Mr. Volming, who throughout the evidence emphasized the importance of this Treasury Department and its efficiency. Maybe let's spend some time on it and just tell us, for us to be able to understand the composition of this unit and the caliber of people that were employed within it and the qualifications that they possessed for them to be able to undertake this transaction. I think it's quite important in the light of these issues that you've now raised.
Chair, I think if we look at the Transnet Treasury environment in 2014, and I'm going to try to give a perspective in terms of the years. Ms. Makgatlo was the group treasurer. Prior to her, was Ms. Disebo Mupuli, who was the treasurer for a while, a long period of time, as I remember, and she was widely regarded as a very significant treasurer in the local and global banking circles. Ms. Makhato had been in the Treasury team as a deputy treasurer for a long period of time as well. We had a gentleman, Mr. Danny Smith, who was also a deputy treasurer, and if my memory serves me correctly, Mr. Danny Smith spent more than 30 years at Transnet and retired at Transnet. We also have an area called the dealing room, and the dealers that are in that dealing room ordinarily will get involved in assessing loans, arrangements for certain vanilla transactions, swaps. They will be the ones who will actually look at whether this is plausible for Transnet to continue. They will assess it in line with global trends, what facilities we are able to secure at what rates, whether these things make sense, the terms, looking at how a loan may impact our ability to repay the loan in years to come, because these are termed loans, some of them, up to 15 years. So the Transnet Treasury team are a very competent group of people. They have different roles. Some of them are client-facing or facing the banks, talking to the banks on a regular basis. Others are sitting in the back office and actually crunching out the numbers and making sure that the transactions are processed correctly and assessed correctly. They deal with very complex financial models. Truth be told, Chair, some of them I battle to grasp at the first sense, and sometimes not even the third time, but that is their job. And these are people that are looking at complex finance structures, deal structuring, etc. So there's a high level of competence in this particular environment. It's not, these will be ordinarily people that are qualified in degrees in finance and in the field of corporate finance. So that is ordinarily what we look at.
I think it would be helpful if in due course we could just get a profile of that unit during that time when it was decided that it was necessary to get an outside firm to do what they could do, to say it consisted maybe, I don't know what the numbers are, but you might not need to include everybody, but the important, people, what their qualifications were, what experience they had at the time, how long they had been at Transnet, and maybe even some of the big transactions in which they had been involved, if possible, just to compare what Transnet had in terms of expertise and experience that could have been used.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, I think to summarize, I will provide that in due course, Chair.
Yes.
But to give you a summary of some of the seasoned professionals that are in the Transnet Treasury, when we commenced this process to unravel what actually transpired, as I said in one meeting, the board chairperson made a statement to say that information at his disposal was that the regiment's people had infiltrated our dealing room. Our dealing room is a very sacrosanct environment. And what we then later found out, and the people sat with us and said, no, the regiment's team never came into the dealing room. The dealing room just left and went to regiment's offices. That's essentially the summary that one of the traders put on the table, which is quite a telling statement, that the transactions were now not being executed by Transnet. They were being executed by a third party who had a very significant interest because they were getting paid literally hundreds of millions of rands.
Yes, thank you.
Chair, I see now it's almost 5 to 4. We are just about to deal with a new topic that is quite long. We won't be able to finalize it even if we try. Would this be appropriate to adjourn at this
I'm
stage?
jealous of the 5 minutes.
I know, Chair, but when you come to this rate swaps and everything, it needs a far much more fresher
Yeah.
mind.
Okay, no, that's fine. But we may have to start early tomorrow. Now we do need to, I know we talked about starting early. We need to really go back to that to try and cover as many witnesses as we can. Because if we start, for example, at 9 o'clock every day and finish 9 o'clock instead of 10, and finish at 5 o'clock instead of 4, that means we add 2 hours to the day. After 5 days, that's 10 hours.
10 hours.
And that means, another witness or 2 witnesses. But having said that, I'm aware of other considerations. So, but I just want to mention that we do need to see what we can do, bearing in mind that I appreciate other considerations. With regard to tomorrow, I wouldn't like a situation where we finish with Mr. Mohamedi maybe an hour earlier and then we have to lose an hour or 2 hours earlier. I don't know how long we will be with him. So if there is any chance that if we finish
With
earlier
him,
than
another
normal with him,
witness.
there would be a witness ready. That would be helpful.
We look into that, Chair.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So what do you think about starting at least maybe 9:30 tomorrow? Or you, Mr. Mohammed,
It's in
you,
order,
you
Chair. We
would
can
be
start
fine.
at 9:30.
Okay, I do have, there is an unlikely possibility that I might have to change that. So I just want to mention, so let's leave it at 9:30. But if the situation that might demand my presence somewhere prevails, then Mr. Mohammed would be advised, and I'll let you know, and then we could start either at 10 o'clock or a little later
Yes.
than that. Yes.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, we'll adjourn now for the day, and then tomorrow, subject to advice to the contrary or for another time, we will start at 9:30. We adjourn.
All rise.